The wind tore through the valley, like a wild animal, its claws raking across the skeletal branches of cottonwoods and rattling the tin roofs of empty sheds. Rain lashed in slanted sheets, battering the earth until puddles turned into streams and mud swallowed fence posts whole. Through the chaos of the storm, a faint sound rose, a muffled whinny, too weak to carry far, but stubborn enough to resist being drowned by thunder. The noise seemed to belong not to the night, but to a creature clinging desperately to it. Beneath the sagging tarp tied to the rotting skeleton of forgotten pen, something moved. A trembling flank, slick with rain and muck, shivered beneath the weight of neglect. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant revealed the form of a horse, ribs stark against its hide, eyes dulled by hunger, yet glimmering with the smallest spark of fight. Miles away, Ethan McAllister drove his pickup along the back road that twisted through the ranching country he'd called home all his life. He was no stranger to nights like this, nights when the weather seemed intent on testing every ounce of patience a man carried. The wipers scraped back and forth, smearing water rather than clearing it, and he leaned forward in the seat, jaw set. His ranch, a modest spread of weathered barns and wide pasture land, waited at the end of the road. So did silence, and the kind of solitude that gnawed at a man's bones when the day's work was done. Once, there had been laughter at the table, a soft voice humming in the kitchen. Those days were gone, carried off by illness and time, leaving behind the stoic shell of a man who filled his hours with labor and his nights with memory. Ethan had planned to ride out the storm at home, but fate rarely cared for plans. As he rounded a bend, his headlights swept across the shadow of the abandoned lot just beyond the tree line. Most folks in the county avoided that place. Its owner had packed up years ago, leaving nothing but broken fences and rusted machinery scattered like bones. Yet tonight something caught Ethan's attention, movement where none should be. The beam of his headlights flickered against the tarp, lifting and dropping like the wings of a desperate bird. Then came the sound, thin, pitiful, unmistakable. A horse. He braked hard, gravel skittering under the tires, and killed the engine. The storm pressed in, howling as if to warn him off. But Ethan was already out of the cab, rain soaking through his hat and jacket in seconds. He trudged toward the sound, boots sinking into mud that clung like tar. His heart thudded not from exertion, but from something deeper, a familiar ache that whispered of loss and responsibility. He knew cruelty when he saw it. He had buried enough animals in his years to recognize neglect's signature. The tarp sagged under the weight of rainwater. Ethan grabbed the edge and flung it back. The sight beneath it made his breath hitch. The mare lay collapsed against the mud, legs folded awkwardly, her body little more than skin stretched over bone. Her coat, once white perhaps, was now stained with filth, patches of hair missing, sores along her sides. She tried to raise her head when the tarp came away, but the effort ended in a weak tremor. Her eyes met Ethan's, hollow yet pleading, as if she understood that in this stranger stood her only chance. "Damn," he muttered, the word half curse, half prayer. Kneeling, he pressed a hand to her neck. Heat radiated weakly through the soaked hide, and her pulse fluttered under his fingers, frantic but fading. Anger coiled in his gut, hot enough to push back the cold of the rain. Whoever left her here had intended her to vanish into the storm without witness. But she had held on, waiting for someone stubborn enough to care. Ethan rose and scanned the pen, but there was no feed, no water bucket, nothing but mud and rot. The storm hissed in his ears, urging him to leave the hopeless thing where she lay. Logic whispered that she would not last the night, that hauling her back would only bring more suffering. But he remembered his wife's words, spoken years ago while bottle-feeding an orphaned foal on another miserable night like this. Saving one life can save your own. Back then he had laughed, brushing off her soft-hearted wisdom. Tonight, those words anchored themselves in him like barbs. He returned to his truck, grabbed the old horse blanket from behind the seat, and came back. "Come on, girl," he said, voice low and steady, more for himself than her. With careful movements, he draped the blanket over her shivering body, then looped the lead rope he carried out of habit around her neck. It took all his strength and patience to coax her onto trembling legs. Twice she fell back, crashing into the mud. But the third time she managed to stand, swaying like a drunkard. Ethan supported her shoulder, half guiding, half carrying her toward the trailer hitched to his truck. Loading her was a battle against exhaustion. Rain stung his eyes, muscles burned, and the mare resisted with every ounce she had left. Yet finally she staggered up the ramp and collapsed inside the straw-lined floor. Ethan slammed the gate shut, chest heaving, mud plastered to his jeans. For a moment he simply leaned against the trailer, letting the storm wash over him. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't sought it. But walking away was no longer possible. Back in the cab, he glanced at the side mirror. Through the small barred window of the trailer, he saw her lying still, sides rising shallowly with each breath. A fragile flicker of life, entrusted to him now. He gripped the wheel tighter and muttered, "If you live through the night, maybe you were meant to." The storm swallowed the words, carrying them into the black horizon as the truck rolled forward. Behind him, the abandoned lot vanished into darkness, but the decision had already set its course. A man and a broken horse, bound by chance and storm, were heading into a future neither yet understood. The storm had loosened its grip by dawn, leaving behind a gray sky heavy with the smell of wet earth and the steady drip of rainwater from barn eaves. Ethan guided the trailer into the yard, his body aching from the long night, yet his mind restless, alert. As he killed the engine, silence rushed in, broken only by the muted sound of hooves shifting weakly within the trailer. He stepped out, mud sucking at his boots, and for a long moment simply studied the barn that had stood through his family's generations. Weathered timbers, sagging in places, patched by his hands year after year. It was no palace, but it had been a sanctuary to every creature he'd cared for. Now it would have to serve one more. The mare struggled to rise when he opened the trailer door, eyes rolling at the sudden brightness. Ethan moved slowly, speaking in tones so quiet they barely carried beyond the rain. "Easy now. You're safe." His voice cracked, though whether from exhaustion or something deeper, he wasn't sure. With careful persistence, he coaxed her down the ramp, bracing her weight against his shoulder when her legs buckled. Somehow, step by trembling step, they crossed the threshold into the barn. The smell of hay and dust enveloped them, warm against the damp chill. He guided her into the nearest stall, lined with clean straw, and lowered her gently to the bedding. She lay still, sides heaving, as though she'd surrendered the last of her strength in making it this far. Clara appeared not long after, her truck crunching over the gravel drive. She was younger than Ethan by 2 decades, wiry and sharp-eyed, with hands that carried the same calluses as his. She had been working alongside him for 3 years, ever since she wandered into town and refused to leave until someone gave her a chance. Ethan trusted her, though he rarely said so outright. She entered the barn, stopped short at the sight of the horse, and let out a low whistle. "Good God, Ethan, where'd you find her?" "Abandoned lot by Miller's Ridge," he said, stripping off his soaked jacket. His eyes stayed on the mare, as though he feared she might vanish if he blinked. "Left to die under a tarp." Clara crouched, examining the sores, the jutting bones, the dull coat. She shook her head, anger flaring in her expression. "It's a wonder she's breathing. Whoever left her like this?" She didn't finish the sentence, though her silence spoke louder than words. Instead, she fetched water, easing a bucket toward the mare's lips. The horse sniffed, lapped weakly, then turned her head away, too spent to drink more. Clara looked at Ethan. "She's gonna need more than we can give." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We'll give her what we can." He fetched a small flake of hay, set it within reach, and watched as the mare nosed it without interest. He could feel Clara's gaze on him, weighing his resolve, questioning the sense in it. But he didn't waver. The decision had already rooted itself inside him, unshakable. They worked in silence for hours, tending to the wounds, drying her soaked coat, rubbing warmth back into the frail body. Each task was a reminder of how fragile she was, and yet also of how determined Ethan felt. By mid-morning, the mare's eyes had softened, following him whenever he moved. He noticed it, that fragile tether of trust, and it struck something deep within him. "She's got spirit," he murmured, almost to himself. "Spirit's half the fight." "Spirit won't keep her alive." Clara replied, though her tone carried no malice. She, too, lingered by the stall longer than her chores required. When Ethan draped another blanket over the horse, Clara asked, "You gonna name her?" He hesitated. Naming meant claiming, and claiming meant responsibility. Still, as he studied her, this creature that had refused to surrender despite everything, one word rose in his mind. "Grace," he said finally. "She deserves at least that." The name settled between them like a vow. From that moment, she was no longer a nameless cast-off. She was Grace, a being whose survival was now bound to Ethan's will. Days unfolded in a rhythm both exhausting and fragile. Every morning, Ethan rose before dawn, not to mend fences or ride the pastures, but to check on Grace. He coaxed her to eat slivers of hay, measured out grain in cautious handfuls, and held buckets steady while she drank. Clara hovered nearby, offering advice, muttering doubts, yet never failing to lend her hands. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mare responded. The dullness in her eyes gave way to flickers of awareness. Her legs steadied. She lifted her head when Ethan entered the stall. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Ethan felt the change within himself as much as he saw it in her. The barn no longer echoed with emptiness. His days, once filled with silence heavy as stone, now carried purpose beyond mere survival. At night, when he should have collapsed into sleep, he found himself sitting by Grace's stall, speaking softly to her as though she understood. He told her things he hadn't said aloud in years. The weight of running the ranch alone, the ache of losing his wife, the gnawing question of whether he'd already lived the best of his days. Grace listened with the patience of one who had known suffering herself. Her steady breathing became his answer. Clara noticed the shift, though she kept her comments spare. One evening, as they closed up the barn, she leaned against the doorframe and studied Ethan. "She trusts you," she said. "That's rare for one that's been through hell." Ethan gave a short laugh. "Maybe she's just desperate. Or maybe she sees something you don't," Clara countered. Then she pushed off the frame, leaving him to mull over her words. By the end of the first week, Grace managed to stand without support. Ethan's heart lifted at the sight, pride swelling as if she were his own blood. But the victory was short-lived. That night, as wind rattled the barn again, Grace collapsed suddenly, her breath ragged, eyes rolling back. Ethan rushed to her side, dropping to his knees in the straw. Panic surged, raw and unfiltered. He pressed his hands against her neck, feeling for the pulse that still fluttered but weakly. "Don't you quit on me now," he whispered fiercely. His voice cracked, desperation bleeding through the words. "You've come too far. You fight." Clara appeared in the doorway, eyes wide, but Ethan barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the shallow rise and fall of the mare's chest, the fragile thread that tethered her to life. He stayed there, whispering, urging, refusing to let go. The night stretched endless, the outcome uncertain, but one truth had taken root so deeply it could not be shaken. He would not abandon her. Not now, not ever. The lantern light flickered against the stall walls, shadows stretching long. In that wavering glow, a man and a broken horse battled silently against the weight of death, clinging to the fragile promise of survival. And though neither could know what the morning might bring, both had already crossed the threshold where fate was no longer left to chance. The night bled slowly into morning, the pale light of dawn slipping through cracks in the barn walls. Ethan had not moved from his place on the straw, his back stiff, knees aching, but he barely noticed. His hand rested on Grace's neck, feeling the faint rhythm of her pulse. Each shallow breath she drew was a gift he guarded fiercely, as if his own resolve could tether her to the world. Exhaustion pressed down like lead, yet he refused to close his eyes. When the rooster crowed, breaking the silence, Grace stirred, her ears flicking weakly. Then, against all odds, she lifted her head. Ethan exhaled, a laugh rough with relief breaking from his chest. "There you are," he whispered. "Knew you weren't done yet." Clara entered soon after, carrying a pail of warm mash laced with supplements from the vet. She froze when she saw Grace upright. "Well, I'll be damned," she murmured. Setting the pail down, she crouched, a small smile tugging at her lips. She's tougher than she looks. Ethan caught the flicker of warmth in Clara's expression and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, Hope didn't feel like a distant stranger. The days that followed were grueling, but they marked the beginning of Grace's transformation. Ethan adjusted his routines around her needs. He rationed her meals carefully, walking the fine line between nourishment and overwhelming her fragile system. Every small sign of progress, a bite of grain, a steady step, was celebrated as though it were a triumph. Clara kept meticulous notes, checking temperatures and wounds, but Ethan relied on instinct, a bond forming that required no ledger. Grace began to meet his gaze with a quiet steadiness, no longer flinching at his touch. Trust, fragile but undeniable, took root. One afternoon, Ethan slipped the halter over her head and led her from the stall. The sun was warm, drying the damp earth, and the air smelled of new grass. Grace hesitated at the doorway, hooves sinking into mud, nostrils flaring as if the world beyond the barn were foreign. Ethan stood patiently, rope slack, murmuring encouragement. "Come on, girl. Just a step." Slowly, painfully, she obeyed, leaning into him as though drawing strength from his presence. By the time they reached the paddock, Ethan's heart swelled with pride. Watching her lift her head toward the sky, ears pricked, he felt as though he were witnessing a resurrection. In the evenings, when the work was done, Ethan found himself speaking to Grace as he brushed her coat. Words poured out without planning, regrets he had buried, grief he had walled away. He spoke of his wife, of the loneliness that shadowed him, of the doubts that plagued him each night. Grace listened, her steady breathing the only reply, but in her presence he felt lighter. It was as if the act of saving her allowed him to salvage the fractured pieces of himself. Clara noticed the change, though she mentioned it only once. "You're not just healing her," she said softly, leaning against the stall. "She's healing you too." Not everyone shared Clara's quiet faith. One afternoon, as Ethan guided Grace along the fence line, his neighbor, Roy Henderson, pulled up in his truck. Roy leaned on the door, chewing a piece of straw, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the mare. "That the wreck you hauled in from Miller's Ridge?" he asked. Ethan nodded, jaw tight. Roy spat into the dirt. "Waste of time, Ethan. She's too far gone. You're throwing good feed after bad." Ethan's grip tightened on the lead rope, but he said nothing. Grace shifted uneasily, ears flicking at the sharpness in Roy's tone. Roy smirked, climbing back into his truck. "Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't warn you." The engine roared to life, and dust kicked up as he drove away. Ethan stroked Grace's neck, murmuring, "Ignore him. He doesn't know you like I do." That night, doubt gnawed at him, the echo of Roy's words lingering in the quiet. What if he was wrong? What if all his efforts only prolonged her suffering? Yet when he returned to the barn and found Grace watching him, eyes bright with a clarity he hadn't seen before, the doubt faltered. She wanted to live. That truth was enough. Training became part of their rhythm. At first, it was simple, short walks, gentle pressure on the halter, teaching her that hands no longer meant harm. Clara watched, offering suggestions, but mostly she let Ethan lead. Slowly, Grace grew steadier, her legs stronger, her steps more certain. There were setbacks, days when she refused to eat, moments when she startled at sudden noises, but Ethan learned patience, adapting his pace to hers. Each obstacle tested him, forcing him to confront his own temper and frustration. He discovered reserves of gentleness he had long buried under grief and solitude. One bright morning, while leading her in the paddock, a truck rattled down the distant road, its engine backfiring with a sharp crack. Grace spooked violently, jerking the rope from Ethan's hand. Panic shot through him as she bolted, her thin frame darting across the field with surprising speed. "Grace!" he shouted, sprinting after her. She veered toward the far fence, hooves slipping in the soft earth. The old boards creaked under the strain, one post already leaning dangerously toward the ravine beyond. Ethan's heart lurched as he realized where she was headed. If she broke through, the slope would take her. He pushed harder, lungs burning, calling her name again and again. Grace skidded to a halt just short of the fence, sides heaving, eyes wild. Ethan slowed, hands outstretched, speaking in the calmest tone he could muster, despite the pounding in his chest. "Easy, girl. It's all right. You're safe." For a tense moment, she teetered on the edge of panic, muscles trembling, but then her ears flicked toward him, recognizing his voice. Inch by inch, he closed the distance, slipped the rope back into his hand, and rested his palm against her shoulder. Relief crashed through him like a wave. He pressed his forehead against her neck, whispering, "Don't scare me like that again." As he led her back, Ethan realized how deeply entwined his fate had become with hers. Every step she took forward pulled him further from the shadows of his own grief. Clara met them at the barn, worry etched across her face, but when she saw Grace calm at Ethan's side, she let out a breath. "She came back to you," Clara said. "That means something." Ethan nodded, though words failed him. In that moment, he knew Grace's journey was no longer about survival alone. It was about trust, about proving that broken things could be made whole again. That night, the barn glowed with lantern light as Ethan brushed Grace's coat until it gleamed faintly. She stood steady, no longer the trembling figure he had found beneath the tarp, but a creature reclaiming her dignity one breath at a time. As he worked, he felt the truth settle firmly in his chest. Saving her was saving him. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with trials neither of them could yet imagine, but the bond forged between man and horse had become unbreakable. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together. The morning broke golden, sunlight spilling across the fields like a benediction. The storm-ravaged ground had dried, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers, pushing through soil newly softened by rain. Ethan stood at the fence, leaning against the rails as he watched Grace move with a steadiness he once thought impossible. Her coat shone now, white dapples catching the light, muscles rippling beneath skin that had once clung to her bones. Each stride she took across the paddock was a silent declaration of survival, and Ethan found himself smiling, not the weary half-smile he'd worn for years, but something deeper, unguarded. Clara joined him, brushing stray hay from her hands. "She looks like a different horse," she said, voice tinged with awe. Ethan nodded slowly. "No," he replied, eyes never leaving Grace. "She looks like the horse she was always meant to be." Yet beneath the surface of progress lingered unease. The memory of Grace's panicked flight toward the broken fence haunted Ethan. It had revealed a truth he could not ignore. Though she trusted him, the world still carried dangers that could undo her fragile peace. He resolved to rebuild the old paddock, to shore up every weakness. But more than that, he knew her healing required more than walls. She needed confidence, the ability to face the unexpected without fear. And he, too, needed to face the doubts that had long corroded his spirit. The next weeks became a crucible of growth for them both. Ethan introduced Grace to new challenges, walking her near the sound of machinery, guiding her through open pasture where the horizon stretched without limits. Each test revealed her resilience, and each setback revealed his capacity for patience. More than once she balked, trembled, even bolted a few paces, but always she circled back to him, drawn by the steadiness in his voice. Clara watched these sessions with quiet satisfaction, though she never hesitated to call Ethan out when frustration flickered. "You're too hard on yourself," she told him one evening. "She doesn't need you to be perfect. She just needs you to stay." The words struck deep, for they echoed the very promise he had silently made the night he first brought Grace home. One afternoon, as cicadas droned in the heat, Ethan led Grace into the far pasture, a stretch of land he had avoided for months. At its edge lay the ravine, where she had nearly ended her life. He wanted to see if she would face it now, not as the broken creature of before, but as the survivor she had become. Grace stiffened when they neared the fence, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. Ethan tightened his grip on the lead, his voice low and steady. "It's just a place, girl. Nothing more." Step by step, she followed, hooves pressing into the earth, until they reached the very boards she had once threatened to shatter. For a tense moment, she quivered, eyes wide, but then she lifted her head high, exhaling as though dismissing the ghost of fear. Ethan stroked her neck, pride swelling in his chest. "That's it," he murmured. "That's courage." But fate had one final test in store. A sudden clap of thunder rolled across the sky, remnants of a storm brewing on the horizon. The sound struck like a whip, and Grace lurched, muscles coiling to flee. Ethan's heart slammed in his chest. This was the moment, the choice between flight and trust. He didn't hold the rope tight, didn't try to restrain her by force. Instead, he planted his boots firm, opened his hands, and spoke with all the conviction he carried. "Grace, with me." The words cut through the rising wind. For an instant, her eyes darted toward freedom, but then they locked on his. Slowly, trembling, she stepped back toward him, pressing her muzzle against his chest. Ethan wrapped his arms around her neck, relief and triumph flooding through him in equal measure. In that embrace, he understood. The horse beneath the tarp was gone. What stood before him was a creature reborn. The weeks that followed solidified her transformation. Grace moved with newfound strength, no longer tentative but assured, her spirit unbroken yet tempered. Ethan, too, changed. He no longer drifted through his days, weighed down by grief. The ranch, once a place of silent labor, rang with purpose. Clara teased that he was softer now, though she said it with pride, not criticism. Neighbors, once skeptical, began to stop by, curiosity pulling them to see the miracle for themselves. Roy Henderson, who had scoffed so loudly before, leaned against the fence one evening, watching Grace trot across the pasture. He shook his head slowly. "I'll admit it, Ethan. I was wrong." Ethan didn't gloat, didn't offer a cutting remark. He simply replied, "She just needed someone to believe in her." The truth of it lingered in the air long after Roy left. Ethan's bond with Grace deepened into something wordless, a rhythm of mutual understanding. She followed his voice, trusted his touch, mirrored his calm. And in her presence, Ethan felt the weight of his wife's absence ease, not erased, but softened by purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in amber light, Ethan saddled Grace for the first time. Clara stood by, hands folded, tension in her eyes. "You sure she's ready?" she asked. Ethan stroked Grace's neck, feeling the steady strength beneath his palm. "She's ready," he said simply. He swung into the saddle, movements deliberate, careful. Grace shifted, then stilled, ears flicking back to catch his voice. Together they moved across the pasture, slow at first, then faster, the rhythm of hooves drumming like a heartbeat. For the first time, Ethan felt not the hollow ache of survival, but the fierce joy of living. That night, after stabling Grace, he walked to the small plot on the hill where his wife rested. The grass there grew tall, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. He knelt, hat in hand, and spoke softly into the quiet. "You were right," he said, voice steady. "Saving her saved me." The wind stirred through the trees, carrying his words as though delivering them to ears unseen. He stood, a man no longer defined by loss, but by the strength he had reclaimed. As the final weeks of summer unfolded, Ethan opened the ranch gates to others, offering space for abandoned horses, strays that needed care. Clara teased him that he was building an ark, but he only smiled. Grace remained at the heart of it all, her presence a living testament to survival, trust, and renewal. Children came to see her, neighbors admired her, but only Ethan understood fully what she represented. Proof that broken things could be made whole, and that hope, once buried, could rise again. On an evening drenched in gold, Ethan leaned against the fence, watching Grace gallop across the pasture, mane flying like a banner in the wind. Each stride was freedom, each breath of victory. He felt a peace settle over him, not the silence of emptiness, but the calm of fulfillment. The journey that had begun beneath a tattered tarp had led them both here, to a life reclaimed, to a bond unbreakable. He whispered into the breeze, words meant for anyone who would listen. Sometimes the life you save ends up saving you. And as the sun sank beyond the horizon, casting the world in hues of fire and promise, Grace ran on, a beacon of resilience against the dying light. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.